All right. All right. Light and love, peace and blessings, everybody. Once again, this is Cosmic Sankofa. This is a special kind of show. I was able to reach out to the author of a book, Caesar's Messiah, the Roman conspiracy to invent Jesus, Mr. Joseph Atwill, and he agreed to come on the show and discuss his work. I think it's a pivotal work in decoding this mystery of Christianity that we have. I've seen a lot of other authors even refer to, if not his work, the methodology that he uses in order to explain how some of the New Testament stories were constructed. But he's a great. It's a great book. I suggest and recommend you go out and get you a copy and understand it and read it. Without further ado, Mr. Atwell, Joe, how are you doing?
I'm just fine.
Okay. To start, what made you write the book? What was the first kind of impulse that you had to do such an in-depth study?
Well, I started doing kind of some research that I was interested in after I had been able to sell some of the businesses that I owned, and so I had some time to do, sort of academic research. I had never done it in my adult life, but I had done it as a student, and so I was really interested in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That was really the thing that led me into all of it. I was interested in how a militaristic messianic group, which is what the Dead Sea Scrolls describe, could cohabitate side by side with an organization like what we call Roman Christianity. I mean, the two organizations were both messianic, but they were just completely politically, opposed to one another. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls were xenophobic. They were very racially oriented. They were fundamental. Okay. And Christianity was more cosmopolitan. It was pacifistic, turn the other cheek, get along with the Roman Empire. And so my question was really simple: is like, how do these organizations abide side by side? And also, why does neither the literature of either organization mention the other one? I mean, I just was perplexed by that. We'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls later, but there's just so many things about the material in the scrolls that are related to Christianity. They talk about a new covenant. They use a lot of the same proof texts for the predicting the future and understanding reality that the Gospels do. So they're very similar, except for the fact that they are completely opposite in terms of their political perspective. So in order to have just a better understanding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly, I started to read Josephus. He's really the only historian of the area that we have really any material from. And so I started to read him, and in the reading of Josephus, trying to understand the scrolls, I noticed that there were a number of passages in Josephus that struck me as being lampoons or somehow mocking stories in Christianity. So this was the first thing. I just noticed that there were these strange parallels between Josephus and stories in the Gospels. And so I was studying them, trying to make sense of this. And I had uncovered quite a few of them. And I also noticed, of course, that events that Jesus had actually predicted were recorded in Josephus. So Josephus talks about Jerusalem being encircled with a wall. Jesus had predicted this. Josephus talks about the temple complex being raised, not one stone atop another. Josephus records this. So there was this historical relationship that wasn't controversial between the Gospels and Josephus. And then there were also these strange, what I believed were mockeries of stories in the Gospels. And then just one day, for no particular reason, it wasn't some kind of methodologic analysis or search, I just realized that everything that I was studying occurred in the same sequence. That was the key insight. I realized that the Gospels had been constructed, the sequence of events had been constructed to mirror the sequence of events that Josephus recorded in the military campaign of Titus Flavius. So this was the the reason that just that process led me to the point where I understood this. No one had ever walked down this path. There really wasn't any sort of New Testament research I could look to try to clarify the matter. I was completely on my own. I was walking down this new path, and I discovered in Matthew that there is a kind of primer, and it's just like 10 events which Matthew gives as of having occurred during the childhood of Jesus. And that little complex of typology, because I'll show in a second that's what it is, that's really the key to understanding the Gospels. It's very simple, and it's right in the very first page. So if you don't mind, just the logic primer here so that everyone can understand exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I was going to say, you said typology, and that's,
I know. What is typology? Well, let me show you what it is. It's like, so we know the story of Jesus. In Matthew 2:13, Joseph has a dream, and he leaves Israel, and he goes to Egypt. Right after that, Herod massacres the boys, Matthew 2:16. And then, while they're there in Egypt, an angel comes and says, they are dead who sought the young child's life, like 2:20. And so then they go from Egypt back to Israel. And then you have Jesus's baptism. He passes through the water, in Matthew 3:13. Now he goes out into the wilderness for 40 days, 40 being the critical link here. But it goes out in the wilderness, and he has the three encounters with Satan, and in the first one, he tells Satan, don't tempt God with bread. And then he says, don't tempt God at all. And then finally he says, worship only God. Okay. So that's basically an outline of the whole, pre-ministry of Jesus from his birth right till the point where his adult ministry begins. There's a lot of other events that make up that story, but these ones are the typologically linked one, because if you analyze these passages in Matthew to the Old Testament, you can see that the author of Matthew constructed his story typologically. He's not writing a history. What he's doing is he's taking stories from the Old Testament and then reworking them with enough parallelism, with enough of the old story in there, so that an alert reader can recognize it. And then he's going through, Matthew is using the sequence of events in the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, Joseph, he dreams, and then he goes to Israel. Then Pharaoh massacres the boys, just like Herod massacres the boys. Pharaoh massacres the boys. Then Exodus 4, the divine person appears, and he tells Moses, they're all dead. All the men are dead who sought the child's life. It's literally the passage, the sentences are almost verbatim. Now you return from Egypt to Israel. In Exodus 14, you pass through water. And this is an example of a real complicated typologic link. I'll return to it in a second. But the Israelites pass through the water just like Jesus has his baptism. Now, in parallel with the story in Jesus, the Israelites go into the wilderness for 40 years. Notice Jesus does for 40 days, but you can see that typology isn't verbatimism. They don't use very often exactly the same thing, but it's close enough. 40 days, 40 years. You can see that they're, that's where the term 40 comes from. They're following the same storyline. Anyway, so now in the wilderness, you have the Israelites tempt God, and this is where the sentences come from in Matthew, where you have the tempted by bread and the statement, do not tempt God. And then finally, Exodus 32, you worship only God. So what the author of Matthew did was he took the events in the Old Testament, he kind of reworked them into the story of Jesus, so that he's giving he's giving a description of a divine link, and he's using typology. Typology just means basing one story on another. That's all it means. And you leave enough of the old story in the new story. There's enough, kind of remnants of the old story, so that an alert reader can see that there is this linkage between the stories, that one story has a relationship to the other. And so in this case, in the case I gave you, what really is occurring is that Matthew is saying that God kind of created the pre-ministry of Jesus with these events to show that Jesus is the new Moses. You see, Moses's life is being repeated in Jesus's life. These events are being repeated. And this is a genre of Hebraic prophecy that is very visible in Dead Sea Scrolls. They have like the Habakkuk Pesher, where the people who are writing material are looking into the Old Testament, trying to see parallels to the present time to try to figure out where the Messiah is going to come. So this is what Matthew did is he was aware of this style of writing, and he uses it to create the pre-ministry of Jesus. Now, anyone can go through the analysis of this, the relationships I gave, and it's just completely indisputable. I mean, no one can look at all of the parallelisms and make any other claim than, well, this is one story is based on the other. Most importantly, because the parallel events occur in the same sequence. Now, remember, getting back to what I was saying, that the thing that I really noticed, was that they were the events in Jesus and in the story of Jesus in the Gospels and in Josephus's history, the things that were connected were in the same sequence. That was what really alerted me, that I was dealing with something far bigger than just a particular, lampoon of story or some sort of connection that was based on a historical event. I realized that the whole body of literature, the whole gospel story of Jesus, was based on Josephus's history of the war. So what has really been overlooked by New Testament scholarship, the reason why my work was original, is that they forgot to analyze the text looking for the importance of sequence. See, in the little storyline I just gave about Jesus and Moses, sequence is the most important part of it. Without sequence, you really, if they just threw these events, in a story like all over the place, no one would ever recognize it. But the fact that they occur in the same sequence makes it coherent, makes it understandable. But no one had ever bothered to look at the adult ministry of Jesus from the Sea of Galilee, where he fishes for men, to the crucifixion, and then on to, his telling Simon he's going to be taken to Rome and martyred. No one had ever bothered to look at these events in terms of their sequence having importance and meaning. And that was sort of the insight I had. And long-winded here to answer your question, once I did the analysis, I was actually, I had no agenda against Christianity. I'd been raised a Catholic, but frankly, people often ask me if I was abused or had some sort of problem. The Catholic priests who were my teachers when I was young, they were the most inspiring people I'd ever met in my entire life. I have nothing but good things about them. And, I was very happy to have had an education with them. I grew up in Japan. And so I was, I had no agenda per se. I had fallen away. I wasn't really a Catholic any longer, but I had nothing, not opposed to Christianity. I didn't have any reason to be so, but I did the analysis, and so I just put it in a box. I didn't even try to do anything with it for almost 2 years. I was a little concerned about it having a bad effect. I didn't know if it would be something that would be, difficult for me or my family. I mean, why would I bring this out? But eventually I showed it to a couple of New Testament scholars, and they said I needed to publish it. And I put out a little pamphlet, just like a 20-page pamphlet, which I put an advertising out in Biblical Archaeological Review or something. And a few people bought it, and then, nothing was really happening. But then a well-known New Testament scholar, got in touch with me, and he's the one who really helped me arrange the book for publication, Robert Eisenman. And so that was, from there, the book was, we eventually published it as a book, and it just took on a life of its own. It became, very popular. A documentary was made, and I'm very happy to have put out the book. I was troubled when I did, but as events have unfolded, I'm really happy that I did, because one of the critical things, that Caesar's Messiah sort of gives to people is the fact that we really need to be skeptical of the history that the oligarchs give us, the ruling class, that they control us with histories which we then think are real, believe, and then lead our lives accordingly. I mean, Jesus is just a classic example of a construction of a history for social control. I mean, the Christianity was then reused by the Roman ruling class that had created Christianity as the basis for the feudal system. I mean, people forget that the feudal system was in existence for 1,500 years, and it was a slave state. All of Europe was enslaved in the feudal system, every person. And so, you had this chain of authority down to the serf, and the serf could not change occupation, had to stay the same job his father had. He couldn't leave his land. His children could be taken but he had Christianity. Told that later on you would get your rewards out in the afterlife. So Christianity was it was used for propaganda, for social control, and I think this is a good it's a good revelation for the public to be aware of today, when the government has so much capacity for creating memes and history, and now even with AI they can create whole visual histories. So I'm happy that I could have written such a book that will help the citizens just stay skeptical, stay critical of what's given to us as history. They tell us about what we are, about what our past are, what they all mean. I really would like to see more just skepticism and critical thinking from the citizen, and disbelief of everything that is told us by the oligarchs.
I agree. Joe, before we move on, I wanted to follow up that with a question. This is my brother, God Energy. He 100%.
Mr. Atwill, nice to meet you, sir.
Nice to meet you. How are you?
Yeah.
I'm all right, sir. How are you today?
It's a perfect day. I'm conscious and ambulatory, so it's about all I can look for at my age. So we're doing good.
All right. That's great to hear.
So I wanted to ask you, extend the conversation a little bit.
Sure.
So the typology and parallel sequences, this is similar to what we see going on with like Noah and Utnapishtim in the Mesopotamian versus the Old Testament story, right? If I'm following you correctly.
Well, sure. I mean, all religious stories that are based on pre-existing stories are typology. They're all a version of typology. Typology has lots of different variations. The example I give you in Matthew is a very, very precise typologic construction. Some of them are very broad. If you look at the like the stories of the flood, that is sort of it begins a lot of religions, like with Noah, but so many other religions have this story. I think they're all based on prior stories. They are the relationship between them, and it's a kind of typology.
Okay. what is your take then on the synoptic problem? Are you which one? Do you even care in your analysis which one is first? Or there's that's a big conversation from like the dominant one we know is the Markian priority. Some people are pushing this Marcion Lucan priority. So what is your take on the synoptic problem?
Well, I'm like the worst thing in the history of New Testament scholarship. I mean, first of all, I showed that they'd overlooked sequence, and in terms of the synoptic problem, I have to sadly inform them that there is no such thing. It doesn't exist. What happened was, you have like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? And
Yes.
then you have a lot differences in the Gospels, and of course they have different names of authorship. So New Testament scholarship took the position that there were three individual writers. They just accepted the text without any critical review of it. They just accepted Matthew, Mark, and Luke were writers of three different books. But then they noticed that there was a problem, and that is that in the three Gospels, the synoptics, you have verbatim passages, and these are perfectly verbatim down to the Greek particles, and they aren't from a wisdom like tradition. In other words, a lot of them are just descriptions of the countryside and stuff. So they need an explanation if you have three different authors. So this was the synoptic problem, and to solve it, they've done almost every imaginable sort of attempt to, like this one came first, this one second, this person then borrowed this one who lost it in a poker game, and then he picked up another one, and they have all these explanations, none of which are none of them can be contradicted or per se, because they're all just conjecture, but none of them are very satisfying. And the problem is this, that if you look at Caesar's Messiah, you'll see that the Gospels were controlled by the Roman imperial family. They didn't have, one author. They had probably teams of people working on this. When they produced them, they gave a name to each one, Matthew, Mark, because they're trying to write a history that would be believed by the masses. But the problem of the verbatim passages does not require that you go to all of this kind of intellectual, kind of pretzel logic that they do to try to solve it. What they should ask, first of all, is, well, were there a Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Because you see, if you get rid of the idea of these individual authors, right? If you just take the name of the author as just part of the story, then what the passages do is they are evidence of the fact that one group controlled the three Gospels. You see, this is the reason why the synoptic problem is never going to be solved, is because the problem doesn't really exist. It exists. People try to solve it because they're trying to maintain Matthew, Mark, and Luke as independent of one another. But as soon as that independence goes away, then the problem goes away. So I hate to say it, but all of the time people have spent trying to solve it without any solutions is wasted. Like a very popular one now is this idea of Q. So what happens is they have Q, and then that's where the three Gospels writers get their passages from. And one person takes these ones and one person takes that one. But you have to invent Q. There's no evidence of Q ever existing. It's just a logical construction out of the premise that you have established without enough evidence to justify it. And so I'm afraid to say, but that parsimony, which is what I'm trying to impose here, it just is perfectly clear that the better solution is that is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke as independent writers didn't exist. They were just perhaps the head scribe of a team that was doing these gospels, but that there was one organizing entity, and that when you see these verbatim passages, you're just looking at first century word processing. They're just, they're just using a story, repeating its use throughout the three gospels. So that's my understanding of the synoptic problem, is that the problem is a false problem that came about to try to keep the independence of the three gospel writers in existence, even though the verbatim passages contradicts this. And my position is that no, much simpler, is just that an organization was responsible for the three gospels.
Okay. God Energy, do you have any? If you have a question, go ahead.
Yeah.
This is exactly where I wanted to chime in. Thank you for offering me the floor. Since we're getting into this conversation about source material, the relationship between the actions in the campaign of Titus and his travelings and the places that Jesus traveled really stood out to me in Caesar's Messiah. The fact that almost the travel path that Jesus took when he was navigating on his mission is almost a reflection of a almost typology of Titus's actions, as you explained. So since we're ruling out a Q document, since we're ruling out a Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, this would then bring us to a source material, an inspiration for this text. And I feel like the comparison you make between the campaign of Titus and the travel path of Jesus's actions might lead us into source material, where this gospel is drawing real information from. And if you could you just explain that, refresh us on this relationship a little bit more, and maybe get us into where some of the source material came from?
Really good question. And, it's one of those amazing things that this actually is described. There is an actual description of the real source material, and it's been overlooked for some reason by everyone. But Josephus recorded that following the war, the material, the military recordings of what occurred were all assembled and given to him, so that he could then use it for the production of his history. But what was given to him was the source material for the Gospels. This is as clear as a bell to me. What he got was all of the details of the war, which then end up in the war, in the story of in the Gospels. So when you're looking for where is the Jesus's prophecy that Jerusalem was going to be encircled, it's in the source material that Josephus had. Where, when you're thinking about the fishing for men, story at the Sea of Galilee, where is the source material for that? It would be in Josephus's collection of military recordings that were made during the war. So in other words, the Romans would have had a scribe basically recording. They were very much military scientists, and so he would have been describing, the journey, where they were, what happened, and then where they went after that. So this is the source material, and it's actually described. The reason, in fact, I think they put that detail into Josephus's history is because they knew perfectly well that someone like you would one day ask that really good question, and they wanted to have the answer. They're waiting for someone who's alert enough to go, where is it? Where is the source material? How come there isn't, some description of it? Well, they were very thorough. The Romans, just to digress, the ruling families were insane, and they were basically made crazy by vanity. I think they had taken self-aggrandizement to an extreme, and their minds started to slip. Remember, we had the imperial cult. Nero would come into a room and they would sing about his divinity, and then they would light human beings who were covered with tar on fire. so that they'd writhe in agony, and this would be a way of worshiping Nero, the god. I mean, so these people are completely nuts, you know. So this is why they produced the Gospels as they were with the typology, and why they recorded where the source material was, because they wanted legacy. They wanted people like you and me to know what they did. They don't want to hide this. They wanted the religion to work, which meant that it had to be hidden. But eventually they knew it was all going to fall, you know, like in Revelation, where they have the New Jerusalem and like the cycle of time, and everything is everything is done with in this cycle. And they wanted us to know what they'd done. And so they left these little details for us to be able to look at and then know what great geniuses they were, to produce something so clever. But unfortunately, as you know, time has gone on, I think that, you know, humans have a little broader perspective now, emotionally and psychologically. And so we aren't going to worship them or think that they're clever, just that they were very, very, very evil.
I get that. And so then that would possibly illuminate the significance of Josephus being attached to the biblical canon in earlier editions.
Yeah, there were some cases when that happened. They normally would always reference the testimony in Flavian. So in other words, if they were talking about the Gospels like in the 11th century, they would mention that Josephus had recorded the existence of Jesus Christ. But the really important understanding that we have of this relationship is from Eusebius. Eusebius wrote that the relationship between the historian Josephus and the writers of the gospel, the relationship was miraculous, and it was marvelously strange. In other words, he's directly talking about the prophecies of Jesus coming to pass, and it looks like it's a miracle because Josephus recorded it. So that was the relationship between, it was, you know, like the Preterites, where the prophecies of Jesus were all historically correct, and Josephus had recorded them. And so this was the reason that the Josephus and the Gospels were often kind of in the same manuscript is because they wanted to show the relationship that Eusebius had described. You see what I mean? They wanted to have the historian to be right there, so a reader could read the history. Read the prophecies, and then just go right to Josephus and see that, hey, this came to pass. Jesus had seen into the future, therefore he was a divine person.
Okay. I can get that. I get that aspect of it, to where they look out into the political realm of what's happening. They can look at the past events of, you know, that occupation of the Romans and see certain things come to pass as prophecy. And that kind of brings me to my last closing question for you. Because when I look at this text, it seems like Jesus is meant to represent our POV for the average Judean, the average Galilean experiencing this Roman occupation, and how the Romans are suggesting one should respond. Instead of responding like a zealot, respond how Jesus is responding. And you can see all of these things and prophecies written into the text that would then confirm a Jew in this era observing Jesus and his actions, and then emulate Jesus's attitude. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Don't fight the Romans like the Maccabees. Don't fight the Romans like the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Turn the other cheek. So as I look at this, I'm getting this feeling that the Romans are producing this text and producing this character for the other Levantine peoples to emulate, instead of having maybe an alternative influence in the culture from the remaining zealots. And the Romans have to put out this text to compete with the zealots.
And does that have any
100%
philosophy?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I couldn't say it any better. That is absolutely, in my opinion, absolutely correct. There were Jews all over the Roman Empire. They weren't just in Judea, they're all over the place. They were worried about rebellion. They knew that this messianic philosophy that was militaristic and xenophobic, if that got going, they'd have trouble everywhere. So they wanted their Jesus, their Messiah, to be pro-Roman, to dilute the message of the zealot Messiah. That was the big political reason for writing the Gospels, is to just kind of tone down the messianic fervor. So what they were doing is they were showing that the proof text, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're looking to a Messiah that's going to be warlike, right? Which
Right.
is totally natural for an Israelite, right? Because look at the history of the Israelites. It's just a bloodbath. You got David. They're always slaughtering and killing, and there's just this big warlike process. So naturally, the Messiah would be in that lineage. He'd be a warrior Messiah. This is what the Jews were looking for. So the Romans said, well,
Yeah.
that's a problem. How about instead of the warrior Messiah, we have like a pacifist Messiah, or a peaceful guy who is sort of pro-Roman and can get along with the Roman Empire. So this was the political rationale for the Gospels.
Yes. Brother Cosmic, can I just add
Yeah, go
one
ahead.
more piece to this?
Mhm.
So, Mr. Atwell, this is where I'm at with this as well. I want to investigate this a little further. What I'm adding to the conversation is that the conflict with the Phoenicians in Carthage, I think, in my own personal opinion, may also play a political factor into this, because the Romans and Greeks were at war with the Levantine people on two fronts, right? One in the Levant and in Carthage. And I feel like the conflict with Carthage, as well as the conflict in the Levant, also motivated the Greeks and Romans to modify this Levantine text in this source material, because it would serve them in the Levant, but it would also serve them with the colonists of Phoenicia and the Carthaginians, who also looked to their ancestry in the Levant as well, who would have been familiar with certain archaic themes that the people of Israel would have been familiar with. You know what I mean? So,
brother, we are of one mind, you and me. where have you been all my life? Look, let me just give you I want to give you a take here. So remember, you had the Roman Carthaginian, which is basically a Semitic, Greco-Roman struggle that went on for hundreds of years. Okay.
yes.
So at the end of it, you've got Hannibal inside Italy, right? And then they have this huge battle, and they can't quite kill him, and they drive him out, and they drive him east, and then they don't know where he disappears. But here's where I pick up the story. What I think happens is they drove him out, and then less than 40 years later, Judas Maccabee pops up. So what I maintain is that what Judas Maccabee is the remnants of Hannibal's army, who have merged with religious zealots, and remember, Hannibal would have had, in my opinion, the Moses stories. He would have had the Moses stories because of the Semitic background and their shared kind of understanding of history. So when he really he's another iteration of the Hannibal army. He conquers Judea, and the first thing they do is they implement fundamental Judaism. They drive out the Grecan, culture with gymnasium, and baths and all of this sexuality. They get rid of that. They compulsorily circumcised anyone who was going to stay in their region. And
the Idumeans.
So that then now Judas Maccabee, in my opinion, that's where he comes from. There is a influence from Hannibal's army, which now appears less than 40 years later and gets into Judea. Now, when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, what you're looking at is basically individuals who have maintained the fundamentalism that Judith Maccabee brought to Israel. So you're really looking at, when we look at the Dead Sea Scrolls versus the Gospels, we're actually looking at it in a kind of broad stroke of the struggle between Carthage and Rome. Whereas Carthage is trying to reestablish itself in Judea, kicking out European influence, European cultural influence, and the Romans finding a way to slither back in, with the family of Herod and different techniques, in order to try to reconquer the place. But that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls are so fascinating. One of the things they're so fascinating is because I think they may actually be reflecting this, not just an ancient Israelite perspective, but a kind of a struggle that goes back thousands of years, between Carthage and Europe. So I can't prove. If you ask me for evidence, I would just say it's a logical conjecture. That is kind of my, way I would explain it. But I'll tell you, I don't know a better one. As you explained the historical situation, I would say that is the clearest explanation of our history, of the history of that region that I've heard. Period. That's it. So
I agree.
There you go. That I think this is, I think that if we can wake up New Testament scholarship, one of the things that they should really start to look at is that whole historical trajectory. They should really try to see how you have a kind of, well, you get into this. I mean, we can even go back to this broader kind of struggle. But the struggle between Carthage and Rome is is not. I don't think it's been really well understood. When in the Kittos Rebellion in 115, people know about the famous rebellion in 66-73, the one that the Gospels are reflecting, with the temple being razed. And they know, a lot of people know about Bar Kokhba, in 133. They know about that because of the Asra. What they don't pick up is the fact that in between that, you had the Kittos Rebellion, 110, 115. When the Jews, however you want to call these people, Israelites, when they got control of Cyprus, they genocided the entire Gentile population, 250,000 people. Mm-hmm. Now that's recorded. So you can see that there is, that the lethality is, it's not just a, contemporary religious struggle. In my opinion, it's very, very deep. It's a very deep struggle that goes back, 1,000 years perhaps. And so we, in our era, we don't really understand it. We can't look back through our historical texts and see the struggle. You've got to, when people ask me about the first century, I say, you cannot trust Josephus one word. It's Roman propaganda. The best way to try to understand the first century is my book, which is ridiculous because all you can do out of my book is just gain some conjecture about what the history was actually like, because you can see what was funny to them. You can see, how they wanted to, what events they wanted to make important. So it's not a really good way of looking at this era at all. I hate to say it. We don't have any understanding of the first century whatsoever, period. None. We don't, the Jesus story is what they gave us. And we know that's, you can just parse that into infinity, into nothingness. So we don't have any, it just goes back to the point I made earlier that, they always use history to control us. That's how we get controlled. They tell us who we are, what we can do, what we have done, what our history is. We don't make up this stuff. We don't know if it's real. They just use this stuff for social control, right? That's what means something to them. They could care less about history. They could care less. Well, why would they give us the real history? All that's going to do is make us rebel, probably. Up with is, Jesus and different kinds of rationale for things like World War I or World War II that make no sense, but they just tell us and we believe them because we don't really. How do we contest it? It's only now. It's like podcasts like the one you're putting out, where the public, we can actually start to go through history a little bit and try to come up with, what is clearly ridiculous and cannot be real, and then see if there's anything that we can, ferret out that's actually, can make some sense and give us a sense of history. But I don't think we're ever going to be able to actually get there because they've destroyed it all. What I tell people is, this is my little, sad to say, but we know more about our future than we do about our past.
Mm.
The future at least is unsullied. I mean, we'll get there and we can kind of like guess at it and make sense with using our own minds. When you look backwards, I mean, that's, the oligarchs are there with their stories, and I don't trust anything that they tell me about anything.
So Joe and God, I want to bring the conversation back a little to a few minutes ago. Like, and at one point in your book, you said that, or if I remember correctly, the Idumeans or the Judeans were treated a certain way, as far as servants and slaves, but the Canaanites were able to be used any way that the people wanted to. So are you also, and I wondered where you got that.
It comes out of the Talmud, and I tell you the truth, I don't have an ounce of belief in any of that. I know that in the Talmud they talk about slavery and they justify it, right? But the New Testament justifies slavery. Apostle Paul says, bondsmen, obey your masters, obey the magistrates. A lot of the philosophy of the Gospels comes from Stoicism. I mean, people have understood this, and the prime guy there is Seneca, and he wrote, "Look, don't be ambitious. The happiest person is someone who accepts his places in life. This is the important thing. If you just accept your place in life, you'll have as much happiness as anyone can have." But you have to remember, Seneca owned 11,000 slaves. So you see, it's a little self-serving, isn't it? A little self-serving. Like, okay, we're going to be happy being your slave and you're going to be happy being our master. But when we do something you don't like and you whip us or kill us, which they could do in Rome, then what do we have to even fight with? If our minds are so messed up by these kinds of ideas that they've given us. I mean, that's literally Seneca. So that Stoicism, in my mind, is just a psychological operation, and it's exactly like the Gospels. And when I was talking about slavery in the Old Testament, I just wanted to make sure that everyone understood that I wasn't just focusing on the Roman use of slaves. This has been obviously an issue throughout mankind's history, and the way that you address the slaves intellectually is critical, and it's been a critical part of how history is constructed, how the stories they give us. I mean, Jesus is a story that was given to us because they wanted the European slaves to not rebel, and the Jewish captives to not rebel. It's all about preventing rebellion, you see. So, I mean, I'm sorry, like a lot of people will not like me for saying this, but that's just this is just a conclusion that drops right out of my analysis. I didn't go into this trying to, have a political position about any of this. I'm just telling you, read the book and you come to your own conclusions about this stuff. This is what I see.
I have a question in reference to timeline.
Yeah.
Okay, and then timeline and content, right? So what would your timeline be for the construction of the Gospels? And then, like, how does that, and then what is your understanding on like why Clement and Polycarp mention no gospel stories, but are dealing with the Docetism type of understanding?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. Well, I think that the Gospels went through lots of different changes. I think that there was probably an original. In fact, here's if I had to guess, and I can only guess because I don't have any text to work from. I can only analyze based out of the analysis I did in Caesar Messiah. But if I had to if someone wanted my best thoughts on it, I would say originally there was just one story, and it would have been written probably during the time when Vespasian in Rome, they wanted this dead Caesars to be deified. It was important for the Caesars family. It gave them status, to have a god in their family. But you didn't just automatically get deification. You had to create a reason for it. And I think that it was during the time when Titus was looking for ways to deify Vespasian that the Flavian campaign, they started to look at it as a divine activity. And I think that would have been kind of the basis for the original gospel, which I think would have been a single story. I think you would have had the history of Josephus on one side and the gospel story of Jesus on the other. No Matthew, Mark, or Luke, just Jesus Christ's story. I think that's the beginning of it. Now, when they went to make it a religion, they realized they couldn't put out the book like that because it was too obvious. They had to hide the typology. They couldn't let it just be too overt. So that's when you get Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because by having three different versions, they could basically put these stories in different places, and they would make it harder and harder for a reader to be able to spot the typology. They wanted it to come out, obviously, but they also wanted it to be hidden to the average person. So the first version would have been just one story of Jesus, and then from there you would have had the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now there was that component. Then after that, I think Domitian, Titus's brother, after Titus's death, decided that he wanted his own Christian storyline. The storyline in the Gospels glamorizes Titus's military campaign, which suggests to me that he oversaw the writing of it, so that it justifies his, divinity, basically. But Domitian, after Titus is dead, says, I would like to have the same thing. I don't get much recognition in the synoptic Gospels. So he then creates the Gospel of John and Revelation and Paul. Paul basically is is Domitian's Jesus. He operates typologically. He's created as a typologic character, like Jesus was relating to Titus's military campaign. Paul is relating to the activities of Domitian. And so I wrote a book called Shakespeare's Secret Messiah. And there I have Paul and Revelation explained. And I also, explained Shakespeare as how it relates to the Flavian typology, because, again, it's, people trying to understand Shakespeare didn't have the advantage of understanding the Flavian typology in the Gospels, so they couldn't really understand the Shakespearean literature. But so I have that literature decoded. It's like, here's what it means, here's who wrote it, and this is how it's relating to the Flavian typology. But then in the book, I also, because the Shakespearean literature is vast and it links to both the synoptics, but also to Paul. So I had to have an explanation of Paul, and I put it in that book. So that's where people are curious about Paul, my take on Paul. It's in the Shakespeare Secret Messiah.
I definitely want to look at that, because then what I noticed about Pauline literature was that it's, Pauline literature, the pastoral epistles, Peter and John, and then Polycarp and Clement, they all sound alike in reference to this Christology that they have. They have no gospel stories for the most part. And I can't really, I don't know the word I'm looking for.
Here's your answer. I mean, it's a really good question. First of all, excellent. Why is there where's the Christology? Well, it's because the people who's overseeing this writing, he doesn't care about Christ. He cares about Domitian. He don't want people thinking about, what that Jesus Christ guy did. That was my brother. Let's talk about the modern Domitian stuff. So the second wave of writing of Christian literature takes up Domitian. But I hate to say it, and here it gets, you'd have to be willing to spend months with me, to get to some of the stuff, because it's really they keep going. But I think they were fiddling with it right up to the time they put out Vaticanus in the 4th century. I think that even Constantine may have been putting little tweaks in and things, because since once you understand that the Gospels are a legacy piece of the Roman Caesars, it's easy to believe and understand that they all wanted to put little pieces of themselves into it. So I would say that the letters, that Timothy is actually Trajan. And I could show you how that works, but to get there, we would have to take, you'd be well sick of me before we even got halfway to that through that. But anyway, so I just think that, once you understand the basic premise that the Gospels are a legacy piece by the Caesars, then it's easy to understand, all of these mysteries need to be looked at through that lens. What is actually the relationship through that lens? When you talk about like Clemens, I mean, he's part of this whole constellation of individuals in early Christianity that the Catholic Encyclopedia calls the Christian Flavi. If you go to the Catholic Encyclopedia, you can see they have it's a whole category. And these are the original Christians. These are the earliest ones we've ever, other than the apostles that we know about. And they're all members of the Flavian family. I mean, they're all Flavians. Well, how did this happen? Well, it makes no sense, but it makes sense. Well, it does make sense if the Flavians actually produce the literature. And that's why, Clemens and Neros and Achilles, I could list them all. They're all they're a list of individuals who are linked into Christianity that start from the Flavian family. There's this whole cult of Veronica, which is kind of fun to look at, which actually has a physical headquarters. One of the few really early Christian kind of concepts that has a physical structure associated with it. So they have the cult of Veronica being in the Herodian compound. It's literally inside the Herodian, where the Herodian magistrate where they lived. Now, Veronica is Latin for Bernice, right? And this is Titus's girlfriend. And in the beginning, they kind of saw them as the same person. They really understood that the Herodian Bernice and Veronica were kind of the same thing. And it became a Christian cult, though, a Christian cult, not a Flavian cult. Somehow it became a Christian cult. Well, how did this happen? Well, it's like, how did Neros and Achilles become the very first names of the first churches in Rome? Well, it's because they're Flavian household servants who were the first Christians. See, so it's the physical evidence, linking the Flavian family into Christianity is there. There is quite a bit of it. It isn't conclusive, but when you look at it through the lens of the analysis I did, then I think it all makes pretty good sense. We can kind of see what happened. They set up the religion. They they set up the miracles. Another good example is Helena, Constantine's mother, and she's the one who found the cross, right? She went into the Holy Land and in like 380 CE, and she found all of these remnants of Jesus's life. Well, how in the world would this happen? It's because Constantine was a Flavian. He wrote inscriptions talking about his first century family and his religious connections to them. And so when you look at Christianity as being created and then promulgated through the Flavian family, then really you have a better understanding of all of history, than we've had heretofore. And I would just say that the questions you're asking are all absolutely terrific, need to be answered. It's hard to answer them specifically, but I can only suggest that the most plausible answer comes through this lens, looking at it as, when you look at all of this stuff, it's just coming out of the imperial family, and they created a false history. They create this character Polycarp, with all of his miracle stuff about his martyrdom. And then you go, well, why isn't he writing about Jesus? It's because they didn't think Jesus was real. They thought he was just a fictional character that they had used to start the religion with. They're really more interested in their present moment. They're interested when Constantine was buried, he got a relic, which I think would be a bone or something, from every one of the 12 apostles. He went out and and then he put them in a circle, himself right in the middle of them, right? So he's making a clear representation as who is Jesus, right? I'm Jesus, and there are all the apostles around me. And I mean, it makes sense when you look at it from a certain perspective, and if you don't understand who actually created the religion, then I mean, it's bizarre and inexplicable. So I hate to be so long-winded. I'm just saying that this is the lens to look at those things through, and you don't get to perfect answers, but you get to the best explanation we can have.
Well, what I like about your work is that you do put a face on the authoritarianism of early Christianity. Like, where do they, I forget the story I was reading, but if I remember correctly, one of the early church fathers was visiting a church community, and he was approving it. He was going to approve it, and I think they had the apocalypse of Peter.
Yeah.
Then, once he saw that they had the apocalypse of Peter, he then had the ability to condemn them. But my question is like, where, if most New Testament scholars that I've read, and the ones that I'm familiar with, they discuss the authority of the church. They just discuss it. They don't talk about it. They don't say where it comes from. It's just, these are the church fathers. They don't explain like why Marcion had to apply to this place and why he got kicked out. Why did Valentinius almost become the Pope, but then something happened with that? They don't explain where this authoritarianism all of a sudden came from. So with your work, though, you say it's coming from this particular ruling family.
Well, let me tell you where it comes from, because it's still visible. So the Roman Catholic Pope is the Deus Max. What is his name? For gosh darn it, senior
Pontiff.
Maximus, right. Now this is a title of Caesar. It's a title of Caesar, and it means he's the head of the Roman College of Priests. Titus Flavius was Pontiff Maximus. When they set up Catholicism, they didn't change the term, right? Caesar just stopped being Caesar, but he kept the other title, Pontiff Maximus, because he was now Pope. That's how he was ruling. Now, St. Peter's today, you see the huge courtyard in front of the thing with the obelisks in it. This is the giant courtyard, St. Peter's. You use Google, you can see how big it is. It isn't close to, or a replica of, or something that is related to. It is the Flavian circus. It is where they would have their chariot races and slaughter slaves and stuff for fun. And the building of St. Peter's is built right on the old Flavian, kind of where they had their like imperial, bureaucracy. So my point is, Caesar he got rid of the title Caesar, but kept the title Pontiff Maximus. He didn't move. They didn't change, didn't go down the block or set up. No, they just stayed where they were. Here's the circus, St. Peter's, we'll just call it this. Now, you ask, well, where does the authority come from? It never disappeared. It never changed. They just changed the name of the slave master. That's all they did. They didn't even change it to a new name. The guy had like 5 names. They just picked one of the names, the one that was religious, and that became the name. And then they gave you the story of Jesus, and the next thing you know, you've got the feudal system. And read about the feudal system. You want to see a slave state. Man, that thing was absolutely brutal. It lasted for 1,500 years. It absolutely destroyed Europe, destroyed the intellectual light of Europe, destroyed the progress that was being made scientifically by Rome. and also the philosophical progress the Greeks were making. Right, they were really getting, kind of humanity was making progress. That all stopped. Dark Ages. Remember, Dark Ages, 1,000 years. Dark Ages. That's Christianity. That's a slave state. So this is the real history. This is not the oligarch storyline. This is the real history. Man, it's a slave state. That's what it is. And these stories are just stories to so you don't notice that you're being controlled and enslaved.
Right. Oh, okay. This you may be able to, and we're going up on an hour, so if you have to go, I understand.
I got a few more minutes. I have to go actually in a bit, but give me another question.
Okay, considering
I can come back if you have.
This is in depth, and I'm definitely gonna get your other book, and I'm gonna go ahead and do that.
No, but please just you just whenever you're bored, just hook up and we can talk, and I'm always happy. And in God Energy, I didn't catch your real name though. Can I? What is his real name?
My real name, I'll have our brother Cosmic communicate that to you privately.
Yeah, just send it to. But it's fine. I like to just have a name.
Yes.
So send me the name. And anyway, I think it's really good. I really think that people need to talk. We need to talk to each other. We learn so much, and if we don't talk, then it just creates the opportunity for the oligarchs to give us these storylines. So that's why we got to use, the internet when it's available, and we've got to use our minds as best we can, because we know the oligarch is coming down the pike with artificial intelligence, with all this stuff to enslave us. So they're up in their game. So we have to up our game. The common people, we have to learn to think really clever. We have to, not clever, but we have to be honest and logical and help one another, because if we all cooperate, we are an enormous power. You see what I mean? You can't fool everybody. So we just have to make sure the lines of communication among ourselves are open. So that's why I'm saying, if you ever just have a thought, just contact me. Let's talk.
Okay. So I wanted to know your take on the so-called Gnostic movement. And then, I don't know, but I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the use of Gnosis the blessed and the development of Sophia of Jesus Christ, right?
Yeah, I know about it. I'm not really have enough kind of understanding where I want to give an opinion about it. I have an opinion about the Gnostics, so if you want to hear that, I mean, the Gnostics, they were found in like the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were found buried, which is the first clue that they represent literature that the oligarchs wanted to have destroyed. Certainly the Dead Sea Scroll, that literature they wanted it gone, and so that's why they had to bury it, hide it. Well, the Gnostic Gospels were found in pots, buried, and it's because it was a kind of Christianity that had developed that preached individual spiritual development. Okay, so the Gnostic Gospels, what they did was they took the Jesus stories, which were being used for social control, and they turned them on their head, and they made stories for Christians, which would go the other direction. Rather than accept the magistrates as having control over you, the Gnostic Gospels are making the point that you should come to your own enlightenment. You should, and Jesus should be a tool for you to learn about yourself and about the real world, but your experience, not this top down, Paul saying obey the magistrates, and this stuff. So that's why they had to be buried. I think, this would be a conjecture, but I would say the Gnostics were an attempt to turn the mind control aspects of the Gospels the oligarchs were using against them, and to create Jesus stories that were more trying to open people's minds to thinking about their plight in life and what they could do as individuals. So that's my take on the Gnostic movement. It's a conjecture. It's just based on some of my reading of the text. But I will say it's it's a coherent framework. That's all I can tell you, at least for me. So.
Okay, appreciate that. Well, let's end this right here, and then pick this up later. Let me go, and then Joe, thank you so much.
No, thank you. No, this is, hey, listen, it's my pleasure. I mean, I tell you, old people, what we really want to see is the independent energy of young people, in our world. I want to think about a future of humanity with free individuals, free thinking individuals. People are not enslaved, by propaganda. That's what I want to think about. That's how I want to look as I go, get on here. So, good luck, brothers. And I hope everything goes, as it should for you. And if I can be of any help at all, let me know. Okay.
I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Peace, everybody.
Yeah, bye.
Yo, that was cool, man.
That was a good one.
That was good. Yo, that's an interesting perspective. I gotta really look at. There's so much going on with that,
I get it. See, the basic identification of the authoritarian figures makes sense. It adds detail to what most biblical scholars that are not believers are pretty much saying. I think his emphasis on it is what might also separate his work, right? Because he puts a lot, he invests a lot in the Roman providence of, the Gospels. And I think the details there are important. The typology, I think, is important. The correlation between Titus and Jesus versus Paul and Domitian, I think, is important, right? This relationship between Paul and Domitian that got highlighted, I think, is very interesting.
That definitely was.
It's interesting, right? It's interesting, especially when you analyze the timeline aspect of it, right? Because certain things would have to happen during the life of Titus and immediately after, and the life of Domitian and immediately after. So then you can compare that to the findings of the earliest Gospels, the earliest text of Luke, the earliest text of Mark, correlate that with the life of Domitian and the era that he lived. When he described a single source gospel, kind of reminds me of Marcion's claim, right? When he said
Q, it kind of, I was getting the Q kind of vibe on that one too.
But Q is kind of fictitious, right? We have more credibility for Marcion, and that's where I tend to lean with that, right? Because we have a man, Marcion, we have a work, Evangelion, we have enough reconstruction of it from the works against heresies, right? So the speculative Q, I feel like Mr. Joseph Atwill is correct. We could kind of dismiss that because it came out of necessity. That's a hypothesis that kind of came out of necessity, but we're working with a model different from that hypothesis anyway, right? Yeah. So I do feel like Marcion's gospel is more of what he was describing. The way Marcion described his gospel as being a Pauline work, a completely Pauline work, meaning a Pauline gospel with Paul's epistles, a complete Pauline work. It seems like it would be in line with this effort of Domitian. You get what I mean? So what he lays out makes sense.
The only issue with that would be Domitian, from the conversation we just had, he said Domitian would have been a later writer.
Yes.
Right.
I had a feeling you were gonna.
Yeah. So then it takes. So then it takes the Marcion priority our Lucan priority kind of into some different directions, because then he's already saying that his theory, I think, fits more with even Clement's statement that when Clement said Matthew was working on a gospel, Clement said Matthew was working on a gospel. So it kind of falls in line with maybe there's a Matthew priority here. Like maybe there was some rudimentary Matthew priority, our gospel, that was written first. You know, when I'm looking at him, I was just listening, hearing what he was saying. And when I said Q, I didn't mean like the actual Q. It just sounded like, a
Yes.
pre-existing document
Yes.
that was
Yes.
the source, as you were saying, that was like the source material that others were coming from. But this is like, and I love just the brute honesty. This is a puzzle that we're just all
Yeah.
trying to put together. We know it's not the literal truth. So it's the puzzle we're trying to piece together. So this was cool. Like I was, man, I'm gonna get over the shock that he just said, cool, let's talk about it and just keep moving
Right.
forward. So this was great,
Yeah.
man. Good. This was definitely good.
But
And
yeah, I did notice the dating aspect when he put it in the Life of Domitian, that dates it, right? So I did, kind of notice that too, as far as Paul's work, the dating of it, you know what I mean? And then the primacy there.
yeah, because he's see, I want to, there's a new book, and there's new stuff coming out that are saying 2nd century, right? That the texts are 2nd century.
I like 2nd century. I
Yeah.
like all that 2nd century stuff.
Yeah, and I'm like, I need to really just copy it. I've just been waiting. And then I forget the lady's name that wrote the book, but it's like it's brand new, and I want to check that out. And then there's this thing called data science, and it's stylometrics.
Yes.
Data science, stylometrics, and looking at how certain things are written and saying
Now,
this is showing that these texts are written by multiple authors.
yes.
Yeah.
But also what they're reliant on, right? Like being reliant on the works of Josephus would date the gospel after Josephus. And I know Dr. David M. Litwall points that out, you know what I mean, for one of his examples. And with what's coming out, I do like the dating of all these, the mentioning of Jesus, the lack of mentioning of Jesus, because that was, I think, the last thing I wanted to chime in on. But I wanted you guys to get your conversation out, because Jesus, he mentioned Jesus not being mentioned, and then you mentioned Jesus being mentioned with a docetic kind of Christology.
Mm-hmm.
So the how Jesus is mentioned, but also the lack of his mentioning is telling as well, because I feel like that points to a later date, right? A later creation, a later construction of the Gospels, and this tradition. In the same way that the fact that Hecataeus of Abdera is the first person to mention Moses, putting him in the Hellenistic period. The first mention we have of Moses is during the Hellenistic period, which correlates with what exactly Mr. Joe Atwill just said about Judaism, and it got skipped over. I know where you wanted to take the conversation, so I didn't want to get trapped where we were at. But it was important when he mentioned Judaism appearing with the Maccabees, right? Because and the lack of mention, right? So Judaism appearing with the Maccabees, you can reference the work of Jonathan Adler, who was an archaeologist. He put out the work, The Origins of Judaism, a historical and archaeological reprisal. And Jonathan Adler is an archaeologist. So what he's uncovering is that what we know of as Judaism does not appear until the Maccabean period. This is very late at that compared to what we would assume or what the tradition suggests. Similar to what we find with Christ. The first mention of Christ is very late. The first mention of Moses is very late. When we look at the physical data, the archaeology is pointing to a later construction of the text. When we look at the archaeological data, it's pointing to a later emergence of Judaism. So you see this parallel that the tradition is trying to antiquate itself. And then when you analyze who is mentioning this tradition and the archaeology, the tradition in both sense gets pushed, further back in date. And I mean, early
It
as
makes
a later
sense.
construction.
Right. And when you really just kind of look at it from a historical perspective, like it makes sense that they're constructing a new tradition. Like even when you talk about early Moses mentions, I mean, Moses from some of the early writers, he takes on so many different roles. Like, I don't know if it was Hectaeus,
Yes.
but they have traditions where Moses actually teaches the Egyptians how to worship the gods. You know what I'm saying? It's in this, they're given Moses, and then I actually think the Exodus story comes from the play. I forget his name, but he's a playwright that existed in the 100s BC era that wrote about the Exodus story. And
So
then
there was, yes, I
yeah,
don't have my notes on it, but yes, he represents the era of Hellenistic Judaism, and he wrote a play, I believe, about Moses or Abraham.
no, it was Moses. It was
It was
Moses.
Moses.
Yeah, it was Moses. And then when you read the play and you look at it, and well, basically the authors had, and even looking at Philo, and then Philo talks about Moses being Moses being a God man, and how, who else? I mean, what type of man would God would have appeared to? And him trying to talk about the holiness of Moses. And so
Right.
what I'm trying to say is there's a freedom of literary, there's a literary freedom that they have in
Yes.
talking about Moses,
The
which is
tradition.
completely different than
Yes.
what we see today with this static, cage-like understanding of Moses. Like, it's given to you in a certain way, and there's no running around that.
Yes. So
There. Go ahead, brother. Yeah.
yes. So to clarify what you're saying, the canon that we have, the tradition that we have of Moses, it was not stable, right? From the references that we're going through, the story of Moses, the attributes of Moses, right? His deeds and dealings, it was not set in stone, right? Moses's character, his journey, there were almost like different episodes depending on which source you go to. The earliest mentions of Moses do not mention him in the context that you find in the Exodus in the Bible, and he has other stories attributed to him. To where the story and tradition of Moses was not canonized, it was not a stable narrative. And that's important. That's very important, because when you see this tradition codifying into what we see it as today in Exodus, it is much later. It is during and after the Maccabean period. And that's important as far as dating when this tradition comes up. And you can use the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I specifically use the Elephantine Papyrus as an example of what was going on outside of this codification or before this codification.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
all of the references you just brought up.
Yep. No, the Elephantine Papyrus is key, because inside there you have what's called the Amherst 63, which is a rendition of Psalms 20. And in Amherst Papyrus 63, which is associated with the Elephantine community, you see them naming different gods, in this song. So you're able to watch and see how they're constructing, this Judaic tradition from, I guess, aligning it with your conversation from these other Canaanite traditions, and then that's also the importance of Elephantine, is seeing that these are, I guess, these are Canaanites, and then how they're worshiping, or how, and we're looking at the Canaanite worship rituals, and we can see a codification begin to happen as time is moving on, and so this even explains the pre-Maccabean era, and why there were so many, Idumeans or Jews that were so liberal in their spirituality, because it wasn't as rigid.
No, it was not.
It
was not. That's what the Dead Sea Scrolls represents, right? An alternative group that was dealing with more than what you find in the biblical canon.
Yep.
And that's why I when I asked Mr. Atwill about the what the Jesus story was supposed to describe and who he was meant to inspire, you always immediately have to juxtapose the pacifist Jesus with the zealots. And the zealots would have had their own congregations. I use that term loosely, for lack of a better term. They would have had their own traditions, text. You get what I mean? Homilies that they are being inspired by and drawing from. So it's always this thing of sectarianism, multiple sects. And that I feel like is a large conversation when it comes to Christianity, because I feel like when we're still looking at the biblical canon, we are still looking at this conversation of Christology between the different Christian sects. That's why you will see remnants of Docetic Christology, Ebionite Christology. You get what I mean?
Oh man, most definitely.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to go there with them. Because it's like you have to whatever you construct in order to say this is the origin of Christianity, you have to include the conversation of the other Christianities that existed. But I do like he's acknowledging, or at least he's saying that what we have today as the four gospels was a continuous project. By that statement, he's acknowledging a rewriting during the 2nd century.
Yes, and he even clearly stated that he feels like additions and you know what I mean, things were being tampered with all the way up until the time of Constantine. He even put a time, you know what I mean? He even gave a date range for how long he feels like this is happening, and that did bring into mind the Council of Nicaea, where they did not discuss biblical canon at Nicaea, but they were discussing the Christology that would influence biblical canon. So I could see the Homoousius Creed being decided upon, right? They're trying to codify this relationship, God the Father, God the Son, the same. And then after that, some fudging being done after Nicaea to reflect what was decided at Nicaea. So a lot of people think that they were getting rid of books and actually deciding biblical canon at Nicaea, but that's not the case, right? They were discussing the Donatist schismatic controversy, where people that gave up Christian writings to the Romans, some people felt that those people who gave up writings should not be able to now hold sacraments and things like that and perform the Eucharist, because they disgraced themselves by giving up their Christian writings. That was discussed at Nicaea. Then also we know the Arius controversy, which dealt with the Christology of this messianic figure. And then whatever they decided at Nicaea then influences the canon after Nicaea.
Right. It gets the ball rolling for them to.
Yes.
What it does is it gets the ball whirling for the state to begin to take control over the expression of this spirituality or of this religion, and then begin to determine which, in a more authoritarian fashion what is and is to not be understood in practice. So yeah.
Oh, what I wanted to, the data science, when you brought up the data science, some of that data science supports the Marcion primacy. That's what I wanted to add. When you bring up the data science, the reason why I even still give credibility to the Marcion primacy thing is because that data science does still suggest and indicate a little bit of primacy for Marcion. So that, you know what I mean? It still has to be hashed out, because even with the data science, it's lending a little bit of credibility to this Marcion thing, but there's not enough. You know what I mean with these texts. Go ahead.
No, the book I'm referring to actually says that Marcion is the author of the Marcionite school is the author of the Pauline letters. So the book that I'm because it, at least historically, what's being said is that Marcion is the first one to come out with Paul.
Yeah.
And so I need to do my own personal study to see, like, I've been trying to see if Polycarp or Clement, have any type of Pauline references.
Oh, yeah.
So I haven't done that just yet. So, but anyway, there it is. Brother got energy. I got to run.
Yes.
Yeah. Always appreciate you, fam.
Yes, sir. I appreciate you inviting me along on this journey. I'll reach out to you and send you some of my personal information. You can shoot over to Mr. Atwill, and definitely try to link me with future discussions with him. I'm interested to pick his brain and see where he's at. I can tell. Oh, what's up?
No, go ahead.
I can tell he's really good as a historian, and like his historical acumen of the chessboard of antiquity. And then we'll have to see how detailed he is with the textual critical analysis. You know what I mean? And I know that's where you're really waiting to get to, into the meat and potatoes.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, fam.
All right, man.
I'll see you on the streets, bro.
Yes, sir. Catch you on the next one.
Peace, peace.
All right, peace.